As you gather, this is nothing formal. It's a celebration of John's life, and all kinds of friends and family, all kinds of friends from different parts of his life. There is food over there, so I'm going to say a few words. I think Guy is. If anyone else wants to say anything, you're welcome to stand on the stool and say embarrassing things about John. So, anyone can say anything if they want to. And as we haven't got a vicar here to give a 10-minute eulogy, I'm going to say something for 10 minutes or so, and I kind of know John a bit better than the vicar would. If you don't know me, I'm Mark. I'm John's little brother, 14 years younger. So he was a big man when I was a little boy. So when I was a boy, I was convinced that John was a bankroller. Because how else could anyone spend their life travelling the world and not have a job? It was the only sensible explanation. And it was only years later that I actually worked out that he did have a job. And his job wasn't travelling, it was making friends. And even visiting interesting places, as we all know, and that was a priority for him. But even more than that was making new friends and visiting old ones. And it's lovely to see many of you here today from different stages of his life. I'm sure there are hundreds more around the world, perhaps even some ladies, who don't know that he's unfortunately left us. And when you look at these photographs of John, and there's quite a lot around, whether he's at prep school standing next to Sir Stanley Matthews, the hero of the day, or you see him next to his sports car or in his tennis gear, there is absolutely no indication that he would turn out to be pathologically averse to settling down to work, or indeed to family life. Now, John went to prep school at Mostyn House, very nearby, as most of you will know, and he was super sporty and in teams for everything. He particularly loved football, he played tennis, and I think, as Guy's going to mention, he was even the school boxing champion. He then went to Stowe, which he hated, and left early. I think I was the only one of my siblings actually liked baseball in school, but then that's me being a bit weird, probably. After he left school, there then followed a period of 7 years where he worked in my father's business, in roles such as running the parts department or managing the car hire business. And he was clearly being groomed to take over the business. But this was not the life he aspired to. Working at Anchor Motors may have filled his late teenage days, but he lived for the evenings and the weekends, for speed, for girls, and for parties. When he was 17, he was told, after harassing our father many times, that he could go to the local motorbike dealer and buy himself a bike. And I believe he purchased a Norton 50, although other people here may know better than me which bike he bought.
It's a photograph of it over there.
There you go. And he did end up in hospital a few times, a few accidents. But to his surprise, and he did tell me quite recently, he was actually quite surprised that he didn't kill himself. But such parental indulgence was the normal state of affairs in our family. And in due course, the motorbike was replaced with cars. At one stage, not one E-Type Jaguar, but two. Lucky boy. By the time he's 25, my father had given up trying to persuade him to come into the family business. And he'd abandoned all thoughts of work for a life of travel. And I'm pretty sure that he never actually had a permanent job ever again. A few months teaching windsurfing to pretty girls in some far-flung country, or helping a friend with a gardening business, perhaps for a few months, or, as he once told me, working as a waiter in a drive-in restaurant in California in the 1970s, frequented by movie stars, where he met people. I think I remember it was Burt Lancaster's son that he got to know quite well, go back to their house, all kinds of great stories. My earliest memories of John were of a man abroad, though, as much as he was at home. Often he'd be away for a year or more, and he was definitely an adventurer, but not an adventurer in a sort of Bear Grylls kind of way, more of a budget tourer, I think would be a better way of describing him. And for many years, he was particularly partial to California, where my sister Sally, later known as Jackie, because that's a Californian name, lived. And there's a great photograph there of him looking like Steve McQueen on a motorbike next to her in California in the 70s. But visits to America were interspersed with more exotic places, almost everywhere in Europe, Africa, South America, Asia, Asia from Australia, New Zealand, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam. But the one that I particularly remember him talking about was going in the very early days of communism on the Trans-Siberian Express, all the way across Europe, through Russia and China, when border guards would come on the train and harass you with their guns, and nobody spoke English. Some amazing stories. And I think there were several stories of him getting mugged in South America, and actually thinking that the police were responsible. So while many people undertaking these kind of journeys would record their travels, photographs, or even write for magazines, sadly, there is no photographic or written evidence of all these adventures that John, maybe the odd story he recalled. But curious to understand just how many countries he visited. With my sons, one night we actually printed up a list of all the countries in the world and asked him which ones he visited. And it was nearly 90. And, you know, we all know that that would not be for 1 or 2 weeks. He was there for a very long time. I reckon he must have spent 15 or 20 years of his life abroad, at least. So as we all know, John shunned possessions of all types, other than his bike and a few out-of-date clothes. In the 1970s, he had a green and white VW camper van that I stayed in rain a bit like today with him once. And there was a brief period in the 90s where he had an old, rusty white Ford Escort estate that was just big enough to fit his bike and all his possessions in the back. And he ironically called it the Rocket. No doubt, yeah, I mean, it was a weird car, I have to say. But he used to have a joke about it, which is he always said, my father always said he'd buy me an estate. An inveterate eccentric, when he was in Britain, he preferred the National Express coach to a train. Only recently he came to stay with me in Cambridge, and he came up from Bournemouth. And I think the journey, if you came by train, would be about 2 hours. And he said he left at 8 in the morning, early evening, because he went a coach and a Victoria coach station, and another coach up to Milton Keynes, and Milton Keynes across to Cambridge. Anyway, if journeys were short, for him, short is up to 20 miles, they'd be on his bike. But he was always on the go. So other than sitting still, this is the way I think, other than sitting still to watch Wimbledon once a year, he really couldn't sit down for long. You probably all remember him sitting down on his knee going like this, always on the go. You know, if it wasn't going for a bike ride or swimming or walking, if you want to paint your house or chop logs for you, anything to keep busy. Probably why I'm the opposite. And his appearance matched that of a globetrotter. He dressed like a student. There are a few pictures of him here in sort of very out-of-date clothes. And basically, I always think that his clothes always look so old that they come back into fashion. But he could be a grumpy bugger at times. And I think having too much free time led to him being very unsure at times what he should be doing today, next week, next month, and resulted in some very silly fallings out, certainly with family. And there were over things that were so petty, I don't think anybody even remembers what they were. But I do know that he regretted all those things and loved the family very much. He always said he'd move back to Cheshire when he got old enough. Unfortunately, he didn't get old enough. Now, John loved a corny joke more than anyone. Laurel and Hardy, Benny Hill, Ken Dodd reflected his slapstick sense of humour. He was an endless source of tasteless wisecracks, as you'll probably remember. A good example of this came every time you told him that somebody you knew had died. And he would always say, "Oh dear, was it anything serious?" A sad but amusing story that I think reflects just what people thought of John and how much he hated possessions happened in the mid-80s. and it's about his friend John Kinney. John Kinney was an English teacher, born and brought up to a wealthy family in Arizona. And he was an obsessive Anglophile. He used to come over every summer, wanting to visit country houses, Stratford, all the usual stuff that an American mad about England would want to visit. And he often used to stay with us, with my then widowed mother in Shropshire, and we got to know him quite well. And he was a larger-than-life character. If you know the American actor John Candy, huge guy, always smiling, cracking jokes. That's what this guy John Kinney was like. And about 10 years after I met John Kinney, my brother John announced one day that the poor chap had died. And he was probably only in his mid-40s, but he was very overweight and had a lot of health problems. You'll never guess what he's done, my brother John said. He's left me everything in his will, including a house in Tucson and a ranch in Arizona. So you will, I'm sure, be unsurprised with how he responded to this. What on earth, John said, am I going to do with a house in Tucson and a ranch in Arizona? Sell them, I said, which he did. And after paying some outrageous medical bills, I'm sure he had a tidy sum left over for more travels around the world. But it does show just what people thought of him. Now, I've lost quite a few precious family people over the last few years. My sisters, Betsy and Sally, brother-in-laws, Brian and David, and now John. But if he had to go, I'm pleased it was on a beautiful beach, because that would suit Southern Bay in Bournemouth. Not on a day like this, and not in a lovely place, obviously, not in a hot place. But if you, interesting as I did, if you search Studland Bay on the interweb, there's a nudist beach there. So I like sitting. So I'm going to finish with a very little joke, and it's a Barry Cryer one that John liked, but he didn't know this one, and hopefully he's listening to it. And it's about a man at his wife's funeral, and he's asked by the vicar if he has any questions. Yes, the man says to the vicar. What's the Wi-Fi code? Well, the vicar is shocked at this callous question and replies, we're burying your wife. To which the man replies, all lowercase? So if you get a glass in your hand, raise your glass to John.
Well done.
Experienced John. I mean, as we mentioned before, he was very good at football, very sociable, had a lovely time at school, at Mostyn House anyway. And when I went, so that was 1959 when he would have been the boxing champion at Mostyn House. And I went to Mostyn House in 1974. I was quite a weedy little kid, really, and I had this idea that I could somehow be like John, and so I signed up for the boxing tournament, the annual boxing tournament, and and there I was listed. Now, the gymnasium at Mostyn House, it was like going to Hogwarts. They had these sort of wooden panelled walls and high windows, a very tall building, and bare wooden floorboards. And they used to tie these ropes across to create a ring. And then they put these little stools in opposite corners. And I sort of watched as all this was going on, as the preparation was going on, and they put benches and chairs, enough for about 100 people. And anyway, the afternoon came, and because I was the youngest, I was in the first fight. And I'd never worn boxing gloves. And I sat on my stool having the boxing gloves tied on my hands, thinking, this is my moment of glory. And my opponent, Douglas Flemington from Ness, I haven't forgotten him. He'd been there the year before. He was quite experienced, and he'd had lessons. Anyway, the bell rang. I stood up, and I got pounded all over the place. I don't think I managed to get one punch in. And I just, I remember leaving that gymnasium completely destroyed. Sort of gulping air. And it only made me admire John more for thinking, gosh, he actually was the champion of this. Then in 1977, Mum and Dad had we'd had the very hot 76, and Dad had decided we needed a swimming pool. So by the summer of 1977, we had a swimming pool, and it was another hot summer. But what I'm getting at here is John would aim to be back at ours really at some point over Christmas, usually Christmas Day. As Mark was saying, sometimes he was away for years, but he would attempt to be back for Christmas Day wherever he'd been. And, a bike would turn up, or he'd get a lift with Mark and Granny. But he would turn up on that morning, usually because he as we were saying before, he didn't like sitting down for long. He'd just take the dogs for a walk in Burton Woods. And then he'd come back, and the food would be close to being cooked, and we'd all, the sort of, with the heat in the house, the windows would be steaming up in the kitchen and everything, and then we'd get this bang on the window, and there John would be in his Speedos, and it didn't matter if it was ice cold outside or snow or whatever, it didn't make any difference, and then off he'd go, and we'd all rush to the French windows by the pool to watch him, and he'd be there limbering up and doing some Muffin Man poses in his little trunks, usually with a very good suntan because he would have come back from somewhere hot. And then he'd sort of swing his arms, while he was building up the courage, and then in he'd go. And I remember we'd all see his face come up, and his eyes would be and he had this sort of wiry hair, which had no really effect. The water didn't really have much of an effect. He'd be down the pool towards us. And then he'd get to the shallow end, and we were only, I suppose, how old would I be at the time? About 12. And he'd be pulling stupid faces, silly faces, and then off he'd go. He'd do a few lengths and get out, and then he'd be sitting with us having the Christmas meal. But that was just typical John. The fact thing is, he continued doing this, and not that long ago. My children were being entertained by him. Exactly the same. So he did it for years. I was just going to finish off one last little story. We lived in Neston, and Theo and Tabitha, our eldest two, which are around here somewhere, they were probably around the same age as Toby and Eva. They were about sort of 8, 7, something like that. And we'd had a very busy day, a weekday. It was a very hot summer's evening. And we'd just gotten to bed. And we just sat down and opened a bottle of wine. And then John just turned up. As everyone here will know, he did that. And he had his rucksack on his back. He took his rucksack off, and he had a couple of these water cannon gun things, which were not like little water pistols. These things were really powerful. And he started filling them up at the kitchen sink. Anyway, the children could hear that he'd arrived, and they came down. And then there was this big battle that went on for about an hour. John got completely soaked, the children got completely soaked, we got soaked, and eventually they went to bed exhausted. And they did go to sleep. And then John sat down and had a chat with us. But as everyone knows, he could rant a little bit about things. He was always unhappy about whatever was going on in the world or whatever. But at the same time, he was a very, very good listener. And I think that's why a lot of people liked him so much. He had the time to listen to people. And he really cared about people as well. And he loved everyone. He may have He may have had his idiosyncrasies, but yeah, the way he was outweighed all that. He had a very, I suppose in a way, he was painfully modest and had a fairly low opinion of himself. And I think in a way, even when he was ill at the end, I think he just thought, well, no one's really going to mind if I just disappeared off the face of the earth. But he has no idea, does he?
Yeah.
And he has so many friends in Bournemouth and Gambia, Australia, all over the world. And as Mark said, some of them don't even know he's gone. They won't believe that he's gone. And in a way, I suppose, we don't really believe he's gone. I'd say just another toast to John.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well done.